Will you all pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be pleasing and acceptable to you, God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So just a few short weeks ago, I gave a very brief 3.5-minute homily during our wonderful music presentation, thanks to our choir and wonderful musicians. And in it, I talked, again, very briefly about the complicated feelings I had around the reality that this was my 10th Christmas without my father, and how it was painful that he wasn't here to celebrate this season with my 17-month-old daughter. And I was surprised. I was surprised by how strong of a response I got from folks about this, again, short little message. I think I had more people come talk to me than I ever had before, even though it was the shortest sermon I ever gave. And this probably says something about pastors being long-winded in their sermons, right? I was surprised by how this small, simple story seemed to connect so deeply with people because it wasn't the whole story. It was just a really, really small part of it. But something about that little story seemed to catch your attention. It seemed like nearly every person who came to talk to me about the homily brought up a little bit of their own story. Again, usually really brief, but a story that held in tension that pain and joy of their life. Something emotionally complex, yet it was described in a really brief and impactful way. The word personal comes to mind. These brief stories were all deeply personal, intimate, vulnerable things that we don't normally share with other people. This Sunday, we're beginning our worship series on addressing mental health. And as we begin this really important conversation, I want us to keep in the forefront of our minds the deeply personal nature of this topic. This isn't something we normally talk about in public spaces. And even when we do, it's often brief. It's pulled to the side, it's whispered, it's sensitive and emotionally charged. It's certainly not something we typically talk about from the pulpit like I'm doing right now, because it's messy, it's uncomfortable. And it can be a bit unsettling for many of us because we have had personal, up-close challenges and experiences with mental health. And to be frank, I personally have had very close experiences with it, and it is unsettling for me. But today I'd like to let you all in more than normal. I'd like to share with you all more about my father, because there's more to his and my story. And my hope is that by doing this, it'll foster a safe space where we can begin to share our mental health stories with each other in this church. And so for my own sake, I'm going to take a moment to pause and allow you all to pause. Take a deep breath in. So, my father's name was Tom, and he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder when I was a young child. And if you don't know much about bipolar, it's defined by its extremely manic highs and its really, really depressive lows. There were times when my dad was the most charismatic and kind and brilliant person you could possibly imagine. And then there were seasons when he was so low that it felt impossible to move him out of the depths that he was stuck in. And these experiences with my father were incredibly disorienting to me. As a young child and throughout my teenage years, I didn't understand what was going on because it wasn't talked about in our home. In fact, it wasn't until I went off to college, and in my final year of it, I took a psychology class, I learned what bipolar disorder was. And I remember going home and asking my mom directly, if my dad had bipolar disorder. And I very clearly remember her response. My mother's response to me was that it was personal. So they never talked about it with my brother and I. I want to name that moment was really tragic for me, because I had been living confused throughout my whole life about my dad's seemingly erratic behavior. I didn't have a way to explain to myself or my friends or others what was happening with him. There's no way to talk about it because his diagnosis stayed behind closed doors. He was just labeled as crazy by other people. And when you're labeled as crazy, it does things both to you and the people who love you. What this crazy label did to my father was, I would say, cruel. And it really affected his sense of self-worth. Each time he did something crazy, it led to someone ending a friendship with him, or him losing a job, or eventually even my parents splitting up. And because of this, he felt more and more worthless because he couldn't, quote unquote, keep it together. And eventually he gave up trying to keep it all together. He embraced his crazy label and quit taking his medication and became that crazy drunk down at the end of the street, as grief and loneliness swallowed him up whole. Even though I personally wasn't labeled as crazy, I was still the crazy person's child, and it led to my own mental health challenges around self-worth. As a child, I constantly wondered what was wrong with me and my family when my friends said they couldn't come over to my house because of my dad. In my teenage years, I seldom felt heard or understood from adults when I tried to explain the challenges of my home life. And in college, I often felt hopeless and lonely because no matter how many times I drove home 2 hours to take him to the hospital or tried to convince him to stop drinking, or however much I prayed, it never led to any real change. This label of being crazy left us isolated, without a community, and without the support we each needed. And we suffered because of it. In different ways, my dad and I suffered, but we each suffered because we were told we weren't worthwhile. We weren't worthwhile because my dad was crazy. My father's story ended in tragedy, and I believe largely because he didn't feel understood or genuinely loved by really hardly anyone. And from what I can tell, this is a common story for many folks when it comes to their mental health. There seems to be more stories of people who feel misunderstood and labeled and unloved when it comes to their mental health, compared to stories filled with empathy, care, and companionship. And this leads to tragedy. And so I, as an adult, often spend a lot of my time wondering how tragedies could end differently. And I also wonder why I'm still here and my dad is gone. Why did our stories end differently from each other? And the best answer I can honestly come up with is because I found a faith community who cared enough to listen to me and my story, while my father's faith community ignored all the signs that he needed help. And I have an example of this. In the later years of his life, my father would still go to church on Sundays, and he would always try not to drink anything leading up to the service, so he would present as normal. And one Sunday I went with him, and there's this moment, and it still sticks in my mind, but there's this moment where he went up to receive communion. This is a church where we knelt to receive communion. And he was having withdraws so badly from not having alcohol in his system that he couldn't move. He couldn't take the bread that was being offered to him, and he couldn't get up off of his knees. And the worst part about it was the pastor giving us the communion bread didn't even notice. He didn't notice that my dad needed help. He just put the bread in his hands and moved on. I had to grab this pastor's coat and say, please, we need help. And so some ushers came and helped him back to his seat. But after the service, no one followed up with us. No one came to check on my father and I after this. It was a really public incident. No one called or came by to visit. And I can't help to compare that experience of his church to the church that made space for me after I finished college. There were people there who did follow up. They took time to take me out to lunch once a month and listen to my mental health stories. They patiently listened as I processed my internal narratives and that were telling me that I was worthless. They connected me to a spiritual director and a therapist and even helped me pay for those services so I could get the help I needed. I found a church who really embraced a radical posture of unconditional love that's really exhibited in our story today by God when Jesus is baptized. I heard the people of the church say, "No, Ryan, you're not worthless. You are God's beloved, and God is well pleased with you." And I believed them. Not because they said, "You're loved." I believed I was loved by them because they followed through on that claim. They did what baptized people are supposed to do. They didn't withhold their own belovedness. They followed in Jesus' footsteps and spread that claim of belovedness beyond themselves. They acted with great love. I grew to believe that I was loved by God and others, despite my background and my challenges with mental health, because the people in this church continued to name that I was loved, and they acted on that claim. We here in church have the potential to do a great deal of good or a great deal of harm when it comes to someone's mental health experience. We can influence whether someone's story ends up in being a tragedy or ends up being a life well lived. When churches are at our worst, we utterly fail to make space for people like my father who desperately need a loving community to intervene. And when we're at our best, it can lead to a situation like myself, where someone finds a deep and profound sense of healing in their life because a church loves them so well. So, as a church here, as Christians, we have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to seriously consider how we're going to respond to someone's mental health story, because there are real consequences based on what we do and what we don't do. We have a responsibility to remember the story of Jesus' baptism, how he was named as beloved by God, and how then he named that belovedness in others, especially those who are on the outside of society, those who we call crazy. We have to remember that our baptism calls us as a church to carry on this practice of naming people's belovedness, especially when it comes to someone's mental health experience. So during this series, and I hope well beyond it, if and whenever we find ourselves bravely sharing our mental health stories with each other, again, even if they're really brief, Let's make sure we're a church living into this posture of belovedness. And as you all know me, I wouldn't ask you to do something without it being, I think, reasonable. And in my mind, practicing belovedness with each other's mental health stories looks a little bit like this. When you realize someone is sharing a mental health story with you, please stop and give them your full attention. Please resist any temptation within yourself to avoid the conversation or make an excuse that you need to leave because you're uncomfortable. And as you listen, please don't interrupt or dismiss their experience. Ask them curious questions. If you don't know what to ask, try focusing on what you appreciated or noticed or wondered about their story. And I suggest writing that down somewhere. I noticed, I wondered, and I appreciated. Have those in your back pocket because they'll make you a better listener in any conversation. And before you depart from each other, let the person know how much you care for them. And then put something on the calendar with them where you can follow up with each other. Don't let the conversation end there. Continue to make space for them and their story in your life. Now, I recognize these may seem like small things, but they truly matter and they can go a long way. Because they did for me. And I believe these are things that each and every one of us can do. We can do those things. And finally, I want to name that if you feel alone, if you feel isolated, if you feel unloved, please know that we are here. There is a community of people here who want to listen, who want to journey alongside you and your story, who want to love you. You're not alone. So please reach out because we love you and we want to know what you're going through. So remember, you are loved. You specifically are loved. Let's never forget this truth, and may we be a church that follows through on that claim. Amen.